Hello once again, everyone. So this video is just talking a little bit about something that came up in one of my classes recently, and I wanted to just kind of talk about it. So basically this is the idea of a disconnected or untethered lunge, and really this can also be applied to a bunch of other kinds of footwork that we'll talk about in a moment. So what am I on about? Basically the idea is when we execute most of our lunges, at least, we have a foot that tethers to the ground. So even though I am applying force forward when I straighten that leg, it stays pretty much where I was. That then allows me to recover back to that same position. Now, the idea of untethering myself, and this may be happening intentionally or unintentionally, is where I'm going to add just a little bit more juice off of that leg so that I slightly move forward. Now, this can be a more or less dramatic difference depending upon what you're going for, how much power you have in your lunge, etc. But why would you want to do one versus the other? And where does it really come up in general? So essentially, it can come up as just a way of gaining a little bit of extra distance. So right now, I'm in my lunge distance for hitting Bob here. I extend, lunge, and I can hit comfortably, then return back. I even could have been a little further away. But when it comes to launching attacks from out of distance, then that is where being able to carry myself slightly into distance can make a huge difference in my ability to hit and threaten. So, seems pretty worthwhile. Should I always be doing that? Not necessarily. So, the thing that you've got to be cautious about, because we'll be worried about it before we start using it, is that tether point where I leave my back leg is what I'm going to be reloading on. So I find that when people aren't aware of that tether and they're throwing themselves forward, now when they recover back, they've gotten a lot closer to the opponent than they intended. Now, the opponent may retreat, etc., so this isn't necessarily always guaranteed to be a bad thing. But what you want to watch out for is if you're always getting closer when you attack, eventually you're going to be within firing back range, especially if someone starts timing you. So whereas normally, if I was doing my lunge out here, I've recovered back to full distance. If I'm letting myself get closer, now I've got a problem. Now you can adjust this by getting into the habit of recover retreat, which in general is not a bad habit to get into anyway. So here's my kind of normal distance. I extend, lunge, recover, no problem, and then if I need to, I can retreat. If I'm a little bit further out, I can extend, lunge, recover, retreat, and I'm pretty much back to where I was. Kind of dealing with my advance that I get off of the lunge by just adding that extra retreat. Not a bad thing. So that's one way to get around it, but when, besides just pure range, is this actually useful? So another place, and the place that actually this came up, was in regards to the idea of wedging. So, what do I mean by wedging? I mean that you are needing to apply force equally on two different points. The point in which I will be making contact, and the point which is going to create my wedge, usually somewhere in the center line, though that can also be applied to other points. Basically, it's going to be the same as what the rapier does when you extend down the middle line, right? Now, in the case of what we were talking about backsword, right? So our action was, from outside guard, we were going ahead and lunging and pushing forward so that our basket caught what we were going at, throwing their tip off to the side, but our cut was still landing strongly. So I'm not going 1, 2, but instead from here, 1, and just kind of pushing that forward. Now, depending upon your range, that's more or less feasible. So normally, if you're looking to reach something and you're further away, that tip starts extending. Which if that tip starts extending, that basket starts to get higher. Meaning it becomes harder and harder for you to guarantee the wedge that you need. So you either get more wedge and then don't hit, or you extend for the hit but don't get the wedge. This is a problem. And one solution would be to get physically closer to the opponent before you launch your attack. Problem with that being, of course, now I am physically closer to my opponent. So while I can do my comfortable normal lunge, I am much tighter in than I normally want to be, which unless they are afraid of me, not a good place to be. So the solution to this is to go ahead and use a untethered or disconnected lunge to push the shape a little deeper in. Now note, I'm not saying push knee deeper in, I'm talking about pushing the shape deeper in. So what I mean by this is when I finish my cut with this action, I will be here. I will be at my extension, my sword will be in the inside guard, and I will have essentially just cut forward. I want to make sure that when I do my lunge, that has been pushed in just a little bit deeper than it normally would, and I achieve that by untethering my back foot. In this case, since I'm specifically wedging my opponent and I can accommodate for where their sword is going to go, this is not a bad thing. The only thing I need to watch out for is, and this usually doesn't happen since you're lunging, not getting physically closer. I'm still attacking from my same distance. The only thing I need to watch out for is getting a little too close because I got a bit extra power. But again, I don't find that normally happens. Because if I'm firing it from out here, even if I really push off my back leg, that's about as close as I get. So that's still perfectly desirable. That's not deeper than I need to be. I'm still very much out on the weak of my weapon and thus able to recover and then retreat in good order. So that's one example of that. And that's one example of that being used in a good way, I would say. So perhaps if you are finding there are actions that deal with 2 points of contact like that, and you can't quite get it to work from the range that you need normally, try adding that idea of disconnect. Now, a place that'll come up in particular that is a little more obvious is when you start talking about, longsword or other more, passing-oriented footwork. So we do this all the time, right? If we're talking about just a normal passing step, then that's about my range. Now, you guys have obviously seen me throw attacks from much further away, right? Reason being is because from here, I'm going to load my weight onto that leg as I start my cut, and then I'm pushing that same shape forward again. And in the case of right now, I'm moving a little bit offline. I don't necessarily have to, especially if I know I'm going to be creating a wedge. Then that wedge can come down, and that's often how you get a good zorn or things along those lines. It's the exact same idea. All I'm doing is just, rather than leaving this in place that I can then reliably bring it back from, or that I can also then move off from, which I'll get back again to in a moment, I'm just pushing that shape a little bit extra with a passing step, which really, if you break it down, is more like I'm moving into the position to lunge and then lunging. It's just all happening sequentially. So, if you find, once again, that you're having a little trouble creating wedges from distance, maybe you just need a little bit of extra spring. Now, there are times when maybe spring is not in your best interest in this same regard, because you can have too much of a good thing. So, for example, when are times that I would enter with a spring but then not continue to use them? Let's talk about lateral, right? So I come in, spring from my distance. Now, I could absolutely spring again, but I need to be careful where I spring. If I spring forward on my diagonal again with my next cut, I end up way too deep. If I just step, not necessarily in a bad situation, but I'm still more in front of him than I want to be. If I spring that way, however, so now my passing step is happening on this plane of action, now I'm back to my good range again, and I get a lot more lateral reach. So this idea of untethering yourself, in regards to linear fighting, really only happens in that plane, but in regards to, you start applying it to more passing work style and kind of three-dimensional fighting, as it were, it comes up more than you think. And perhaps there are moments in there where you are not quite getting where you need to go, and perhaps the reason is that you're remaining tethered, or perhaps you're getting more than you need is because you should tether yourself. So just a little rabbit hole for us to discuss and give you some ideas to ponder over since it came up recently. But certainly, in regards to giving yourself the ability to wedge at 2 points from distance, pushing that shape forward with that spring, as opposed to getting physically closer, can make a huge difference. And not to mention as well, this idea of strengthening your legs and being able to cast yourself forward, be it with a lunge or with a passing step, is a very, very useful thing to develop, regardless of what height of fighter you are, as you're going to need that ability to deceive people about just how far you can really engage from. And once you learn how to spring forward, of course, there's my retreating step, there's my retreating spring, you can start using it in all three dimensions. And that's also true for linear fighting, you know. Just because I'm mostly used to springing forward or springing backwards doesn't mean I couldn't apply that in quick over movement or things along those lines. And once you got those built up, you'll have a lot of other fun options for you. But either way, thank you, Bob. And thank you all very much for watching. I'd love to hear your thoughts if you have any on these, but otherwise, we'll go over some other techniques another time.